Co-ops have a clear right to accept or reject prospective purchasers, but that's not the case in a condominium. The only right a condo board has over a prospective purchaser is a right of first refusal, which means the condo would have to buy the apartment instead of the purchaser. Not a realistic scenario for most. But there are some options for condo boards.
I'm Tina Larson with the Flonsson Group. We deliver done-for-you property management searches. You make the final call, we handle the rest. Add to that our seamless project management and strategic cost optimization. And you get a partner that empowers boards to make smart, confident decisions that move your building forward.
I'm Carol Ott with Habitat Magazine, and my guest today is Leni Cummins, partner at Cozen O'Connor. Welcome, Leni.
Thank you, Carol.
So let's start off with a basic question. What is the typical process that a prospective condo buyer goes through to buy an apartment?
Similar to in a co-op, purchasers will submit an application that usually gets processed by a managing agent. While the applications aren't usually as robust as in a co-op setting, they're still very comprehensive. And they'll include things like 2 or 3 years of tax returns, letters of reference, bank statements, letters from employers, and a whole host of other types of identification questions and questions into financial background.
So I just want to say that, okay, so the board or the managing agent gets all this stuff, can perhaps look at it, but can they take any action on it?
So this is where the nuance is. Because of the restraint against alienation in condominiums, the rule against restraint against alienation, real property has to be freely transferable. That's different from a co-op, which isn't technically real property. And so the condominium board, like you said, is really only permitted to exercise the right of first refusal and stand in the shoes of a buyer to sort of adopt the contract of sale and become the buyer. That right is subject to a provision in the condominium's bylaws. And by the way, if it's not there, there is no right. It's not an automatic right. So the first thing to do is to check the bylaws to see if it's there. It is very common though. And then what happens is if the board receives an application, it usually has 20 or 30 days within which to review the application and make a determination. Again, not to accept or reject, but whether to exercise. So there's no option to say, we don't like this particular purchaser. Their finances are not as robust as we would like. They would have to scrap the money from the unit owners and buy the apartment in most cases. It's very unrealistic. So what I've been advising is that this is really a procedural question. It's not about the judgment of the board. The question really becomes, did the purchaser complete the application? So I look at this more as a two-step process, Carol. Mm-hmm. Step one is the managing agent, in most cases, receives the application, usually on some portal. And the question is it complete? The managing agent should look at that. If there aren't 2 or 3 years, as might be required, of financial data, the application isn't complete. And it doesn't go to the board to make a determination. So that's the real distinction. I look at it more like a two-step. Procedural first, and then substantive business judgment once it gets to the board.
Okay, so we've got a procedure, but there must be a certain type of potential buyer where this procedure is really going to be helpful to the condominium board to say the application is not complete. It can't just be the ordinary Joe, because if you forgot to put something, you're going to include it. So what kind of buyer is this screening for, really?
Right. So it's typically the single purpose entity or the trust or the single owner LLC that's created for typically the purpose of just buying this singular asset and shielding the beneficial owner from liability.
And what is the potential liability for the condo? Why would they care if a potential owner was an LLC or a trust?
Well, for one, the privity between the condo board and the owner is just that. It's not related to this beneficial owner, this individual. So in the LLC, a single purpose entity context, if the entity doesn't have 2 or 3 years of returns or any money in their bank account, what good is it going to be to the board to enforce the obligations, especially the financial ones, against this single purpose entity? It's the individual behind the single purpose entity that likely has the assets. And it is very hard, particularly in Manhattan, to pierce through that entity to get to the individual.
So what's the remedy?
So one of the options is to, again, at the managing agent level, I want to be very clear, this is not a board making a qualification or a condition on exercising the right of first refusal. But the managing agent can, if the board adopts such a policy, advise that the application is incomplete and it's not going to be sent to the board. However, if you want to supply the financial data for the beneficial owner and create a guarantee or an escrow or even an occupancy agreement or all three, depending on the situation, with the beneficial owner, then the board might deem the application complete when it would otherwise be rendered incomplete. And then it would go to the board.
And give me reasons why a condo wouldn't want an LLC as an owner. What's the impediments to that?
It's not that they wouldn't want it. It's more that, let's say the LLC didn't pay its common charges.
Mm-hmm.
A very simple fact pattern, a common fact pattern. The only recourse for the condominium would be to foreclose on a lien in order to collect from a sale of the unit. The problem is that in a condominium, again, different from a co-op, a first mortgage takes senior and has senior priority over the condominium's lien. So if this LLC purchaser is taking a first mortgage with a very high loan to value ratio, there's actually potentially no assets or equity that would be available to the condominium in the event of a financial default.
And if the condo was in the name of a trust or an LLC, without having a person behind that, are there difficulties if there's a problem? For instance, they're not paying their common charges or whatever else they may not be doing. Is there a problem in reaching in legally in getting money from an LLC or a trust?
Well, if there's no assets. Trust is a sort of a more complicated question because that will depend on the type of trust. And we do adopt, for both condos and co-ops, fairly robust trust policies related to spendthrift provisions and other provisions that could be created for the trust and in the trust for the sole purpose of protecting the trust assets. So that's a little more complicated, but yeah.
So if in a typical situation, if a condo owner, let's say, falls behind in paying common charges, let's say there's a managing agent, they'll, draft some letter saying, you're behind, and then maybe it'll go to legal. Now an LLC owns it. Is that process the same or different?
It's the exact same process. It's just you're writing to potentially a PO box, right? I mean, you don't necessarily even know an individual's name.
I see. And if you don't know the individual's name and the P.O. box owner gives you no response, what would be a condominium's options then?
Lien and foreclose. And that's just in the context of a common charge foreclosure, I mean, we didn't even begin touching issues with the occupants, right? We don't know who the occupants are going to be. And what happens if the occupants are violating the house rules or the bylaws and you need to enforce it? The condominium board doesn't have a direct relationship with these occupants. Who are they? There's no legal relationship there. It's not a landlord-tenant relationship, and they're not an owner.
So a typical condominium could put, do they put in their house rules? Do they put in their bylaws? Or where would they put some notification that about the procedure? This is what we're going to need, and we won't be able to process this unless we have all these elements.
So there's two, I guess, preemptive things that a condo board can do. One is take a hard look at your purchase application. Make sure you're requesting what you expect, and it's not just a form. Make sure you're asking for those 3 years or 3 months of pay stubs, or whatever. If this is a real concern in your building, and you represent or you're on a board of a building with a lot of entity purchasers where you might have had trouble in the past, really the first step is looking at the purchase application. The second step is talking to the managing agent and making sure that they're not actually submitting these incomplete packages to the board for review. You don't want this getting before the board until it's complete. On the board side, this should be discussed with general counsel. Is this something that is a concern or an issue? Typically, I'm only consulted once there is a problem, and we kind of deal with it for the next one. But preemptively, boards can make these policies. And no, it does not need to be in a bylaw amendment, and it doesn't even need to be in a house rule. This could simply be a policy that is adopted to deal with this type of situation. It could be a policy document.
Let me ask, if a board didn't do this, I mean, this may be a little bit out of left field, but would they not be doing their fiduciary duty?
Wow, that's a great question, Carol. Well, fiduciary duty is really based on whether the board is enforcing its own rules. The provisions regarding the right of first refusal do typically require the board to exercise judgment, which means review the application. So in that case, thinking about your question, is if the application is incomplete, I suppose the board could then be making a decision on an incomplete application in its business judgment. So I would say it's probably not a breach of fiduciary duty for a board to act on an incomplete application, but it's certainly a great question and something to think about.
And if a condo does adopt this, where they're going to, on the procedure, particularly for buyers who are LLCs or trusts, does this make them a little bit more like co-ops at all?
Maybe, perhaps. The real difference in the purchase application process between a co-op and a condo is that the co-ops really interview, right? It's more about the person and the occupant and the community. This isn't taking it that far, right? We're still not interviewing an applicant. This really isn't so much about occupancy.
But you're getting a person's name.
But you are getting a person's name.
Which is a step.
So yes, I think it's a step closer, but it's still not, a co-op.
And in most condominiums, and perhaps you might know, are there a lot of purchasers, whether it's a high end or, just sort of a middle income condominium, whatever that may be in New York City? Are there a lot of purchasers that are LLCs or trusts, or a significant number?
Oh, yeah. I mean, obviously, every building has its own flavor and personality. But yeah, there are a lot of buildings, whether it's, investors who are buying them as investment rental properties, or just high net worth individuals who are trying to protect themselves from liability, or it could be somebody trying to protect their anonymity, whether they're a high profile person or somebody that's, in the
criminal.
News. Yeah. Hopefully not a criminal.
Sort of bottom line, what would be your sort of go-to advice for the traditional condo board?
Listen, if this is a problem in your building, and you'll know if it is, or if you think it could be a problem, speak to your general counsel, review your purchase application, and really have a conversation with the managing agent, whoever is processing these applications, and make it be very clear that you don't want these applications coming over in front of the board at their next meeting if they're not incomplete. This should be a question. What do? We have an incomplete application. And then at that point, the board can decide, listen, we want to go the route of requiring a personal guarantee. We want 2 years of escrow, or an occupancy agreement, or all of the above.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. It's really good advice.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Carol.